Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. Since this series of videos is about the coming crisis which will change very soon the face of the world, I must talk about the invasion of Europe by millions of false refugees, an invasion which could very soon change that continent, maybe forever. The fact that most Europeans don't know how to react to that massive invasion of poor Muslims is another proof that mankind is incapable to adapt to the present acceleration of history. To stop that invasion and to save their civilization and their standard of living, Europeans would need a lot of time to change the multicultural values they adopted after the Nazi massacres. But unfortunately, time is a luxury they don't have these days. For Europeans, that invasion is problematic for two main reasons. First, because Muslims are impossible to assimilate and don't want to assimilate. For instance, a non-Muslim boy is not allowed to marry a Muslim girl. The second reason is because Europe is a continent where it is extremely easy to enter. If you take any world map, you will see that apart from Europe, the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, it is difficult to reach the center of the other continents. Africa, for example, is a very massive continent with very few bays, peninsulas, or coastal islands. Moving in or out of Africa is also made difficult by the fact that most of its navigable rivers are interrupted by rapids or cataracts, sometimes just before reaching the oceans. It is like that because the interior of the continent is made of plateaus. Black Africa is also isolated from the rest of the world by the Sahara and the Kalahari Desert and by its vast, unhealthy equatorial rainforests. The difficulty to penetrate Africa has been largely responsible for the cultural and technical backwardness of its populations throughout history. Black Africans have always been among the last ones to adopt the most efficient techniques developed somewhere else on the planet. Their continent has been the last one to become industrialized, and nowadays, on our rapidly dying planet, it is the last one to have a 19th century birth rate. In the past, Africans paid a very heavy price for that backwardness. If they have been so easily enslaved by the Romans, the Arabs, and the Europeans, it was essentially because they had inferior weapons. South America also is a massive continent with a very short coastline and with very poorly developed equatorial rivers like the Amazon or the Orinoco. North America also is so massive and difficult to penetrate that European settlers took 2.5 centuries to conquer it. Yes, the continent has some very large navigable rivers, but the Mackenzie flows towards the Arctic Ocean. The St. Lawrence is interrupted by rapids near Montreal, and the Mississippi River is too shallow for most oceanic ships. The three Americas are so isolated that their three greatest indigenous civilizations had a continental nature. The Inca and the Aztec civilizations grew on plateaus in Peru and in modern-day Mexico, while the Mayan civilization grew on the flat lowlands of Yucatan, a peninsula which doesn't have large rivers flowing towards the ocean. Australia also is a massive continent without any large navigable river. It is a desert. Asia is so massive that China, for example, always had an isolated and purely continental civilization. The same is true, but to a lesser degree, for India. It is characteristic that until the 16th century, those two countries were rarely attacked by invaders coming from the sea. Russia is maybe the best example of a naturally closed country with a purely continental civilization. Russia has never been invaded by sea, and those who tried it by land, Napoleon and Hitler for example, have been defeated by its climate and its immensity. Geographically speaking, Europe is in a class of its own. It's the only heavily populated continent with a very easy access to the oceans. Europe has a very complicated coastline with a lot of bays, peninsulas and archipelagos. It also has many coastal low-lying plains and many very long navigable rivers like the Rhine, the Po or the Danube. Finally, Northern Europe is linked to Asia by a very long plain which starts at the Atlantic Ocean and goes till Siberia and beyond. Culturally speaking, that openness has been extremely productive. Because it is very easy to communicate by sea, Europe has always been a very rich cultural melting pot. In the past, that openness has worked both ways. When Europe was powerful, it could easily create empires, maritime empires, on the coast of different continents. It happened when with the Greek, the Roman and the 19th century European empires. When Europe was weak, however, it could easily be invaded by people coming from all directions. It happened at the end of the Roman empires when the Huns, the Germans and the Vikings forced Europeans to build a complex network of walled cities and castles. Those invasions have been so important that even today many European regions still wear the names of their ancient invaders. England, the Angles, France, the Franks, Normandy, the Normans, Brittany, the Britons, Andalusia, the Vandals, the Lombardy, the Lombards, etc. Something interesting. If the invasions coming to Europe by the north and the northeast always ended up creating very homogeneous nations, it never happened with the invasions coming from the south and the southeast. Since the Mediterranean Sea is a pretty narrow body of waters between southern Europe and North Africa, commerce, cultural relation and intermarriages should have created a more or less homogeneous civilization on both shores of that sea. If that never happened, even during the Roman or the Byzantine empires, it is because there is a fundamental opposition between the European cultures and the North African cultures. Such a long-lasting opposition must have a geopolitical explanation. What can it be? First, if Southern Europe has a very long and complicated coastline which makes international relations easier, North Africa is quite different. It has a very straight coastline without any large navigable rivers flowing towards the Mediterranean Sea, the only exception being, of course, the Nile. Second, and this is capital, Europe has a much more humid climate, and as a consequence, its inhabitants have developed dense and peaceful agricultural societies, while North Africa is a long and narrow band of semi-arid coastal plains surrounded on their southern flank by the Sahara, the largest desert in the world. Because the North African geography has an east-west orientation, the region has always been a corridor for the invading nomads and the cattle raisers of the Middle East, who could easily feed themselves during their voyages by pillaging the isolated farming communities located along the Mediterranean coast or in the oasis of the Sahara. In other words, the Mediterranean Sea put in contact the humid and very organized agricultural world of Europe and the very dry nomadic world of North Africa. This is clearly visible on this satellite photograph. The fact of the matter is that nowhere the nomadic and the sedentary cultures have had an easy relationship. Almost everywhere, the interests, the mentalities, and the values of the two groups were so different that they refused to intermarry. They normally lived in separate communities even when they shared the very same territory. For farmers, the homeland is a territory with definite borders, and the nation is made of all the individuals who live inside those borders. Because they are producers who need peace and tranquility to cultivate the land, farmers tend to invent pacifist religions like Confucianism in China, Buddhism in India, or Christianity in Europe. Nomads, on the other hand, are predators who rarely manufacture anything. They hunt wild animals, they rear cattle, they do commerce, and sometimes they attack farmers and cities. For nomads, the homeland is made of all the territories they control, and the nation is made of all the nomads who are blood related, and that excludes the neighboring farming communities. The religions invented by nomads tend to justify their predatory lifestyle and tend to condone open discrimination against other human beings, especially against the neighboring farming communities. That sacred separation those religions invent explain why the Vikings and the Mongols of Genghis Khan could kill, rob, or rape millions of people without feeling any remorse. The huge cultural differences between the agricultural nation of Europe and the nomads living in North Africa and in the Middle East explain why the two groups regularly invaded each other throughout history without ever forming an homogeneous civilization. I remind you that Scandinavia and Northern Europe, for example, which are separated by the Baltic Sea, have very similar cultures. Now, let's see what happened in the past. In prehistoric times, North Africa has been invaded by the ancestors of the Berbers, who came from the east. In the first millennium before Christ, the Phoenicians, who founded Carthage in modern-day Tunisia, were also nomads, sea nomads, who came from Lebanon to build many coastal cities in North Africa, in Sicily, and in southern Europe. Some centuries later, Europeans were to push them back when the Romans destroyed the Carthaginians' colonies in Europe before invading North Africa, where they built many European cities. At the end of the Roman Empire, Germanic tribes and the Byzantines also invaded North Africa, only to be kicked out by the Muslims in the 7th century, who, soon after, invaded Sicily, Spain, and southern France. During the Middle Ages, Europeans were to counterattack again to retake Spain, Sicily, and to invade and occupy a small part of the Middle East during the Crusades. In the following centuries, the Muslims would destroy those Middle Eastern European colonies before doing the same thing with the old Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire. The Turks would then proceed to invade a large part of Eastern Europe. Their very last siege of Vienna was in 1683. During the colonial era, Europeans would make another comeback by destroying the Ottoman Empire in Europe and elsewhere, by creating colonies and protectorates all over the Islamic world, and by sending hundreds of thousands of European settlers in North Africa. During the decolonization era, Muslims would kick those settlers out of North Africa before starting to immigrate themselves in Europe. Like everything which is growing at an exponential rate, the present Islamic invasion of Europe has started very modestly after the Second World War, when the American government decided to speed up the reconstruction of Europe by launching the massive investment plan called the Marshall Plan. In each country, the young nationals who had not been killed or maimed by the war were the first to find employment, followed by the millions of immigrants who came from poor European countries like Italy or Portugal, and followed by the first immigrants coming from North Africa and Black Africa. That tide of immigration slowly raised, and by the 1960s, the presence of non-European communities in the poorest neighborhoods of many European cities became obvious. And Europeans started to realize that unlike the Italian and the Portuguese immigrants, Muslims didn't want to disappear in the European melting pots. They had created separate communities where they were imposing their own civilization, a civilization based on nomadic values. And very soon, their extremists started to say that as soon as they would be strong enough, they would impose their laws and values on all Europeans, which of course immediately reignited the age-old conflict between the nomadic and the sedentary lifestyles. It is important to understand that even the Western and the Islamic civilizations are both based on the values, on the ideas of those two very different lifestyles. Psychologically and culturally, modern Muslims are still nomads, and this is true even if they come from the most ancient agricultural and urban societies of the world, namely Egypt, Iraq, or Pakistan. Their values remain the values of a pure nomad like Mohammed. The proof? They themselves say that the Quran didn't change a bit since its recitation in the 7th century. For them, Islam is a totally static ideology, and its destiny is to conquer and rule the world till the end of times. Literally. Because he was a nomad living in Mecca, a city which was very close to one of the most important crossroads of the Arabian Peninsula, Mohammed made a brilliant synthesis of the best ideas of his century, and he created a religion only a nomad could create, a religion based on a sort of universal nationalism. If the mass immigration of Muslims in Europe is a consequence of the overpopulation in Africa, it is also the product of the Western decadence. Historians are very familiar with that phenomenon. Decadence is a sort of cultural disease. It appears when a society has been too rich for too long. It normally precedes the end of that civilization. Now, for you to understand what I will now explain, I need to go back to some basic geopolitical notions. Because energy is rare in this universe, and because it has a natural tendency to disperse, it's a physical law, all living things must produce more than they consume, because there is always some sort of energy loss. In other words, only to survive, life must produce a profit, and the surpluses it produces must be protected behind some sort of borders. It is so important to protect the surpluses we produce that borders can be found all over the living kingdom. It is a universal reality. Each living cell has a border, the cellular membrane. Every plant and every animal has a skin or something similar. All our houses have doors and locks. Farms are normally fenced. Ancient cities had walls around them, and each tribe and nation have very definite borders. Borders are the peaceful and passive signals that after them starts a protected territory. Borders are not an obstacle to peace, they are an obstacle to war. Something important, normally borders concern only the members of the very same species. Their role is to keep away the competitors who need the same territories, the same resources, and the same females. In nature, if 1,000 species share the same territory, you find on that territory 1,000 distinct and overlapping sets of borders. This is like that all over the living kingdom, not only for humans. Now, what happens when a country has been so rich for so long that its inhabitants start believing that being wealthy is something normal and that borders are useless? When that happens, poverty quickly comes back because that population starts wasting much more than what it produces. It becomes a decadent population. People then start having less kids than necessary to replace the existing population. They stop working hard, they stop saving, and they accumulate enormous debts. Not only do they refuse to fight to defend their homeland, but they demand the elimination of borders. And worst of all, they start using enormous quantity of useful resources only for fun. For them, pleasure is a goal in itself, and life must be an eternal party. In order to destroy as much wealth as possible, decadent people tend to put the normal values upside down. For them, whatever was right for their ancestors becomes wrong, and whatever was wrong becomes right. Only because they were born, they believe that they have rights and freedom, but no duties or obligations. You all recognize the ideology which is behind the famous sex and drugs and rock and roll. To feel totally free to destroy as much wealth as they want, decadent people also praise diversity and multiculturalism. As a result, they try to destroy the homogeneous and very efficient societies their ancestors worked so hard to develop in order to produce as much wealth as possible. By the way, what I just said doesn't come from a preacher's sermon. It came from the physical reality of a universe where only nations that produce more than they consume can survive and thrive. I talk about it with much more details in the French-speaking book I put on Amazon.ca. Some people say that the Western world has been destroyed by Nazism. It's false. Everything had been repaired by the 1960s. What is destroying it is decadence. If it ever disappears, it will not be because we are tired of living, but because we are decadent. The reason why we had to increase immigration was because the childless baby boomers are retiring in droves. Political correctness only worsened the situation by promoting abnormal values. Nowadays, you are a Nazi if you want your nation to survive the 21st centuries. In such a context, it's no wonder that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, is working hard to destroy nations which work rather than helping those who don't. In 2015, Merkel decided to open the European borders and to admit 1 million undocumented refugees in Germany without even checking if they were criminals or not. As a result, and it was not a big surprise, the vast majority of the migrants who then entered the European Union were healthy young men of military age. There were very few women and children among them, very few really poor Muslim refugees, but many Islamists and a lot of criminals who came to rob the open and unprotected safe Europe represents for them. For the third time in a century, Germans are creating chaos in Europe. It must be a curse. At the beginning of the 21st century, Europeans are so decadent and are so politically correct that their elites, the politicians, the judges, the journalists, the intellectuals, etc., systematically side with the migrants who rape or rob innocent European citizens. For those politically correct imbeciles, the extremists who cut heads and hands in Syria would never take advantage of their stupidity to enter into Europe. Those assassins would find it immoral. And of course, the thieves who used to attack tourists in the street of Lagos or Karachi would never come to plunder some of the richest nations on the planet. When we read or hear what is written or said in Europe these days, we realize that there is no limit to human stupidity. Imagine the constitution, the laws, and the values of the Norwegians force them to distribute the $1 trillion they have accumulated with their petroleum to all the migrants who will find a way to enter illegally in their country. Why do they do that? Essentially because they want to pay for the crimes committed by the Nazis during their 12 years reign. And who profit from that? Mostly the Islamists, who are extremely proud of all the massacres, the tortures, and the destructions they committed all over the world during 1400 years. On a planet where there are 8 times as many poor people as there are Europeans in Europe, the flow of undocumented migrants will keep growing until the total disappearance of the European wealth and comfort. Being aware of that, European politicians who want to keep their jobs try to stem the tide by asking their navies and their secret services to send back as many refugees as possible. Being hypocrites, they also pay the masters of transit countries like Libya to use as much violence as necessary to push back the migrants who try to cross their territory. Naked violence, shooting people, is precisely the very efficient technique used by their supposedly private mercenaries who, when they eliminate the Somali pirates who attack and ransom the tankers coming from the Persian Gulf. Of course, those dirty little tricks are not going to work, and refugees will continue to pour into Europe until it runs out of money. That outcome seems inevitable since European employers say that most migrants are unemployable. They don't have any technical skill to sell, and they don't even speak local languages. Worse, it costs a lot of money to control the extremists who hide among them. What is happening in Europe these days is the perfect recipe for disaster. Everybody with a brain can see it. To avoid a new religious war, European authorities try to use their usual multicultural method. They tell people that in a democracy, everybody must respect other people's differences. That includes Muslims, blacks and Orientals, but also all the sexual minorities of the LGBT. Only that should generate a lot of turmoil. Imagine the reactions of the Muslim immigrants when they will discover that school teachers explain to their children what is a gay, a queer, or transsexual. A Muslim once told me, "You can corrupt your own kids as much as you want, but nobody will give to my son the menu of all the perversions." That seems pretty clear to me. As I will show you in future videos, the coming financial crisis will be so severe, people will suffer so much, that those problems will seem almost irrelevant. First, that crisis will impoverish Europe a lot. It will be the direct consequence of the hyperinflation created by all the money printing of the present governments. Because people will have less money in their pocket, they will stop spending and companies will start firing employees. Unemployment will then go through the roof at the very moment when millions of retirees will have to go back on the labor market due to the inevitable collapse of our pension systems. In a word, money will disappear along with the social safety nets we put in place during the last decades, which will make Europe much less attractive for migrants. When this will happen, wasting resources and destroying the countries built by their ancestors will appear much less funny to Westerners. Only to make ends meet, most people, especially in the popular classes, will have to go back to the productive values of their forefathers. They will listen even less than today to their politically correct elites, and they will vote en masse for the demagogues who will promise not only to stop helping the migrants, but who will promise to destroy the state within the states which have been built by the Islamists all over Europe. If that happens, and history shows it will, the Mediterranean world should experience another of those regular and brutal separation we talked about between the nomadic world and the sedentary world. There is something else. The coming environmental crisis will have another unsuspected effect. It will reduce the demographic pressure on the borders of Europe by accelerating the present decrease of the birth rate on the other continents. As you can verify with the bibliography I will put at the end of the video, that fertility collapse is already happening. It is so incredibly fast that most people are not aware of it. And among those who know, very few understand the real meaning of it for the future of mankind. I will talk about it in future videos. I thank you to subscribe to my videos, to my channel, to recommend this video to your friends, and to give it the thumbs up. See you next time.